Hi, so this is my third video on the Neoclassical Age. This particular video is going to focus on drama in the Neoclassical Age. Now, in most accounts of the Neoclassical Age, very little references given to women authors, and they've been more or less written out of most accounts. So I should have mentioned that in the novel, for example, you have authors like Sarah Fielding, who's Fielding's sister, and she wrote interesting novels that tended to focus more on feeling, whereas the one I mentioned, Henry Fielding, is more analytical, more interested in psychology, you could say. So she charted a different area in the novel. Now, another interesting example is Charlotte Lennox's novel, The Female Quixote, which is a kind of imitation and a parody of Cervantes's famous Don Quixote, and that follows the same kind of peregrinations of the hero that you find in Tom Jones. This, focus on the traveler who encounters various strange characters on his way, on his travels. Now, in poetry, you had Anne Finch, a countess of Winchelsea, and she wrote poems that tended to let's say they tended to move away from the vision of women as objects of desire in most poetry of the age written by men, and also she tended to write about the satisfactions of marriage, and gave a very different image of women in her poetry. So you can read her poetry in most anthologies. So she tends to be sidelined, but is still present in some accounts. Now, in terms of drama, you have one major writer who's Aphra Behn, and she wrote during the Restoration at a time which was rather misogynistic, tended to use women mostly as the king's mistresses, so, and they were given roles in Restoration drama, which were quite important roles, but often very sexualized roles. So Aphra Behn brought a new perspective. She was this amazing playwright. She was immensely popular in the 17th century, and she also wrote novels. So she had a huge impact on, and was the major exception in the period. Now, the Neoclassical age tended to be rather prescriptive. The Académie française was very prescriptive. The plays that were shown in the Neoclassical Age in Britain were slightly looser adaptations. Dryden, as I said in another video, made Shakespeare's plays more palatable to the Augustine public. By removing archaic words. He even, made one of his tragedies end better in a less tragic way. Right? So there was this view of Shakespeare as a bit too extreme for the Neoclassical Age, and all this was evened out. Shakespeare's lines. Shakespeare's rhymes, but also the violence in some of his plays is very extreme, right? And the Neoclassicists felt that you shouldn't have too much violence in plays, that there should be some some decorum. So there were 5 major rules that dramatists had to abide by. Now, the first one is verisimilitude. Dramatists had to follow, a realist plot line with no intervention of the supernatural or gods. The Deus ex machina idea that the God provides the resolution. All that was unacceptable. You even had to get rid of soliloquies. Often information was conveyed to other characters by a maid, by a servant. You couldn't have a character on the stage talking to the audience. That would be seen as breaking the fourth wall, as it's called. So you couldn't puncture the illusion of realism, of verisimilitude, by addressing the audience directly. The stage should be recognizable as a recognizable place, often in contemporary Britain, right? So in London most particularly. Now, decorum was also very important, right? You should instruct, you should elevate man, not have any filthy language. There was some filthy language in the novel that was more acceptable, most particularly in Gulliver's Travels. You may not have noticed that if you read an expurgated version, an abridged version as a child, but there is a lot of excrement and urine. You probably noticed that in Gulliver's Travels. Now that kind of reference was totally unacceptable on the stage. Right? The stage was seen as a proper place, not the way the Puritans saw it, as a place of vice, but it was a kind of stage where man was set up as a kind of model. In this idea of decorum, there was also the idea that the good characters should be saved and rewarded, and the bad characters should be punished at the end. Right. Another feature that was emphasized was the mixing of genres. Now, Shakespeare tended to mix genres. In his tragedies, there are comic moments. Even in Act 5 of Hamlet, you have the gravedigger scene, which is comic, even though it's several characters have died and more are going to. He mixed them freely in this way. That was seen as improper. Comedies should be purely comic, and tragedies should be purely tragic. Tragedies should end in death, and comedies should end in marriage. And comedies tended to be focused on the working class and the middle class, whereas tragedies had to be more elevated and therefore focus on the tragedies of the upper class. Right, so those things shouldn't really be mixed, was the way that they saw it in those days. Another major thing of importance was the 3 unities, 3 classical unities of time, place, and action. Now, Aristotle emphasizes action, but only describes rather than prescribes the other 2 unities. This idea that the action should take place in one day, and it should be located in one particular place. This was seen as an important plot structuring device. And finally, plays should be structured in 5 acts, because that was the classical prescription. And there should be a play arc, a plot arc. The 3rd act should be the climax, and the 5th act should be the denouement. So there should be metrical regularity and no kind of lexical irregularity at all either. heroic couplets were used throughout by the dramatists. Right, so they tended to rely, as the phrase "the Augustine Age" suggests, on the model of the time of the Emperor Augustus. And Dryden, the major playwright, presented Charles II as a kind of Octavian returning after the Battle of Actium, victoriously reinstated after defeating Mark Antony. So this reference to the Augustine Age is one that was spread by the dramatists and poets of the period. Dryden was one of the very first to make this parallel between the Augustine Age of writing, when you had writers like Ovid and Horace and Virgil, and so this was seen as a heyday in literature in that period of Roman history, which it was, and they wanted to recreate that golden age of literature. So they prophesied that the Augustine Age would be, this Neoclassical Age would be a time of peace, prosperity, and poetry. So poetry was essential on the stage as well. Rather clipped, formal language, not at all the language of the street. You could have the language of the street in comedies, but not in tragedies. Right. So a lot of the plays tended to be conservative. Just as the Augustan poets in the time of the Emperor Augustus tended to veer towards propaganda, a lot of the plays and some of the poems were supposed to be propaganda for Charles II and the later kings and queens of Britain. So drama tends to be ideologically conservative, and it tended to promulgate the ideals of capitalism and imperialism. Right? Those are kind of mystified in the poetry and made to seem natural and desirable in an age of conquest. Thank you. Goodbye.